Look, thanks for coming along today for this launch. That's what the document looks like. Ever since I was appointed as the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, I've been raising questions about the state of New Zealand's environmental information. Almost every investigation I've undertaken has run into problems with the extent and reliability of the information on which policies are based and decisions end up being made. Finally, in this year's budget, about $15 million a year has been set aside to improve the state of environmental information. That's 15 million over 4 years. It's welcome. That's 15 million a year over 4 years. Okay, so 60 million. It's welcome, but it's only a beginning, and it is certainly not a panacea. My new report, Unlocking New Zealand's Environmental Information, builds upon all my previous work and makes recommendations for a future-focused system. It provides a synthesis of our findings, as well as insight into the opportunity that some contemporary and fast-developing technologies provide, which could enable us to make much better use of existing data and gather new data on a scale never before possible. As it currently stands, New Zealand's environmental information system has some fundamental shortcomings. Environmental information is collected by numerous public agencies for various purposes, creating a complex and fragmented information landscape that lacks common data standards, organisation, and oversight. As a result, data gaps exist in some areas, while duplication occurs in others. Valuable data sets are often difficult to access, to discover, they're inaccessible to those who need them, or they're stranded within organisational silos. Environmental information is also collected, of course, in the course of private business activities. Now, they are not my responsibility, but the ability of the public system to interface with that wider community certainly is. Ultimately, this report finds that these issues come down to a lack of leadership within the governmental system. There's no champion advocating for and driving change across the entire environmental information system. Such leadership must come from the government. It's both a key consumer and beneficiary of environmental information. The government needs to position the New Zealand environmental information system as critical infrastructure. Given that, our society and biological economy are dependent on a resilient, well-functioning environment. We currently have a unique opportunity to address these long-standing issues given the wide-ranging reforms to the resource management, science, water services, local government, conservation, and environmental reporting systems that are currently underway. If we don't think about environmental information as critical to these reforms and deem it to be critical infrastructure, history is bound to repeat itself, and any reforms aimed at improving how we manage our environmental impacts will yield mediocre results at best. I'm not calling for more information for information's sake. Better environmental information is critical for good decision-making, for effective environmental management, and public accountability. It's hard to make judgments or run your business if you lack key facts. Decision makers have little hope of being able to judge whether environmental expenditure represents value for money if they can't be confident that environmental outcomes are accurately described and tracked. Improving the ways we collect, manage, and use this information will help New Zealand respond to environmental challenges more effectively. Now, in saying that, I am cognizant that more high-quality, accessible, and integrated information will not of itself solve New Zealand's environmental challenges. But it will make us better positioned to do so. Most of our most difficult environmental challenges are not the result of technological shortcomings. They are human and political. They won't be solved by lots of new data. In short, better information is a necessary but insufficient guarantee of progress. Now, in April last year, as a preliminary output of this investigation, I published a note that made the case for developing a federated information system on which New Zealand's environmental information should be built. To put it simply, a federated system can enable information held across multiple organisations to be connected through the use of shared data standards and coordination agreements. This means that data can be more easily shared, discovered and used, and appears to be the most promising way of integrating information. A federated system could also help address issues such as trust, privacy, and ownership. Now, the announcements in this year's budget suggest that my recommendation registered with the government, although its focus for the moment appears to be limited to implementing the revised planning system. Now, I think it's a welcome first step and a positive start towards improving environmental information and the digital system that supports it. It's an acknowledgement that without investment in solid digital and data foundations, simply changing the policy landscape will not generate the desired outcomes. However, to make the most of our environmental information and the possibilities enabled by a federated system, we need to ensure that these initial investments proposed in Budget 2026 are sustained and extended beyond the planning system. Understanding and managing our physical environment is about more than planning and needs to link a value chain that starts with research and data collection and finishes with its use by businesses and communities. Work needs to focus on building trust and addressing issues around privacy, sharing, ownership, data sovereignty, intellectual property, and commercial sensitivities. It's a long list. It's fairly boring behind the scenes stuff. But if we don't do that properly, it's simply not going to work. Getting the system right is key to maximizing the benefits of the wide range of innovative technologies that are on the horizon and addressing all those issues about how the system is actually operated. Now, in this report, I've taken the opportunity to discuss some of the technologies that offer new ways to collect and analyze information. They're certainly sexier than talking about gathering data and intellectual property and commercial sensitivities. So they're more eye-catching, but this is not a he's all on about tech report. Ultimately, the way you operate the system is what counts. The technologies are a means to generate that data. Rapid advances in sensor technology, for instance, data processing and digital infrastructure are transforming how we can monitor and understand the environment. They open up new opportunities for everyone, from individual farmers to policy ministries, to improve our stewardship of New Zealand's environment and natural resources. I want to make it clear that this office is not some expert in technology assessment. We just highlight these as some of the potentially innovative ways to collect and interrogate additional or complementary information. So remote sensing technologies can enable widespread and more frequent data collection, often in areas that are really not easily accessible. These technologies can be deployed on a range of platforms, from drones to satellites, and they can include a range of sensors such as optical cameras, LiDAR, and radar. Remote sensing is already widely used across New Zealand. However, as with many of these technologies, those deploying or procuring them are often going it alone. I think for the public, some of this stuff is the most amazing, really, and where the ability it's giving us to actually make very granular assessments about change in the physical environment are quite extraordinary, at least if you're like me and you sort of respond to maps. Advances in automatic place-based and high-frequency monitoring can tell us what's happening in near real time. So high-frequency water quality monitoring is particularly valuable at complementing existing networks, as it can help detect both sudden or rapid contamination events and gradual or even more subtle changes. Cameras and acoustic monitoring can help determine the presence and abundance of difficult to monitor species, especially in remote locations and over long periods of time. Obviously, this is particularly useful for biosecurity and biodiversity monitoring programs. In New Zealand, the greatest use of automated cameras is in pest management, where they're used to monitor invasive animals and the success of eradication programs. Passive acoustic monitoring can include applications such as tracking individual birds by their song characteristics or estimating population size. Similarly, advances in eDNA monitoring are making it possible to detect the presence of species from traces of their genetic material left behind in water, soil, or air. This can help us assess the health of species habitats, detect biosecurity incursions, and monitor the outcome of policy and management interventions. And it's also just thoroughly interesting. I've had this done as a landowner on my farm, and as well as discovering hundreds and hundreds of species that I've never heard of, noted the absence of some I wanted and the presence of some that I was hoping were there, but wasn't sure about. Despite the growing potential of all these technologies, many overarching challenges remain. These include common issues surrounding the fragmented and under-resourced way in which organisations often attempt to implement them, as well as trying to manage the rapidly increasing volumes of data that are being collected. However, developments in artificial intelligence, particularly for data analysis and digital infrastructure, make it increasingly feasible to collect and process information at a scale previously unachievable. Machine learning's pattern recognition and data analysis capabilities present significant opportunities for environmental sciences. However, AI models need to be built on high quality data to be reliable. The old truism of garbage in, garbage out applies. Our ongoing and historically poor practices in data documentation and stewardship can throw up significant limitations to how we use these techniques. To make the most of any technology that produces or requires large amounts of data, there needs to be appropriate infrastructure in place to transfer, store, and process that data. Physical and digital infrastructure developments such as edge computing, communications technologies, and cloud computing are enabling better utilization of these techniques. Now, to illustrate the potential of some of these technologies and the system-level changes required, 3 groups of catchments in different regions were chosen to provide a snapshot of where we currently stand and what information could be available in the future to improve decision-making. And the 3 sets of catchments were the Tutaikuri, Ahuriri, Ngahuroro, and Karamu catchments in the Hawke's Bay, which are cheerfully known together as TANK, the Tauranga Moana catchment in the Bay of Plenty, and the Selwyn Waihora catchment in Canterbury. And I'd like to thank the regional councils and territorials that actually assisted us to understand what was happening there and how things could be improved. Individually and collectively, these examples highlight the need to improve existing data quality, particularly by increasing the frequency and spatial distribution of monitoring networks, and to integrate data into coherent, comparable frameworks. Now, overall, these technologies have the potential to add greatly to our information system. They're available now, and many are already being used in New Zealand in some form somewhere. However, their widespread use is currently limited, which begs the question, why, given their promise and potential, aren't these technologies being more widely deployed? And a large part of the answer lies in the inadequate underlying system which is needed to enable and support their use. Now, until recently, my calls to improve environmental information and the environmental information system have been greeted politely, shall we say, but not accorded any particular urgency or priority. Recent decisions to upend our planning and resource allocation laws and I think our science system have exposed the need for a less complacent approach. A world of pre-approved permitted activities without the information needed to set them in the first place and then monitor them is inviting trouble. Despite a widespread appreciation of the importance of better environmental information, we have been woeful at prioritising, coordinating, and adequately resourcing what is needed to succeed. So I'll say it again. Environmental information needs to be treated as critical national infrastructure and managed accordingly. We seem to have no trouble with physical infrastructure, with price tags of billions, often roads. We seem to have a lot of trouble with soft infrastructure, like the environmental information system, whose price tag is significantly less. Now, to address this, I'm making 3 recommendations that relate to the coordination and leadership of New Zealand's environmental information system, and a 4th recommendation concerning the implementation of regional spatial plans to ensure transparency in the underlying information on which they're developed, which I'll come to in a moment. So the recommendations are, first, that the Minister for the Environment should develop a long-term environmental information plan for New Zealand that sets out the steps required to implement a federated information system, to improve the use of existing data, and to unlock the potential of innovation, of innovative technologies. So those are recommendations to the Minister for the Environment. This should include addressing issues of trust, access, how you share data, privacy, data sovereignty, the ownership of information, and technological uptake. Any such plan should be developed in close collaboration with those who, in addition to central government, are key users of environmental information, namely regional and territorial authorities, the environmental research sector, Māori, and the private sector, especially infrastructure providers and land-based industries. But the government has to start by getting its own house in order. Our environmental information system clearly needs better leadership and governance, as well as investment in technologies that can unlock existing and new data streams. This isn't a question of innovation for the sake of innovation. It's about developing the capability that can support industries and populations that are increasingly exposed to the rising costs of environmental breakdown. Currently, I don't think we have the right capabilities in place to make the most of technological innovations and drive the system level changes that are required. In my view, New Zealand needs an agency with the expertise and remit to oversee, coordinate, and implement an effective environmental information system. Such an entity would be responsible for providing strategic direction and ensuring that the right tools, such as national data standards, are available and adopted by all parties across the environmental data supply chain. It also needs to be a centre of expertise that other organisations can draw on. To me, the Environmental Protection Authority is the logical place to house these responsibilities. A properly resourced EPA is the appropriate place to build the body of technical skill that's needed to ensure that regulations are implemented and enforced, and that environmental outcomes are properly monitored. The federation of our fragmented information system and the rollout of some of the technologies I've described in this report require a critical mass of highly skilled people. We're not talking about some huge army, but we need some critical mass. They need a home, and it is not a policy ministry. It's important to underline that a federated environmental information system is not a centralized or monolithic edifice. It's a federation of data held by many different agencies within central and local government, research institutions and universities, and resource users. If people are going to have confidence in the information that they access and confidence in the protection of what they share, they need to know that rigorous data management privacy and commercial protection norms are at the heart of the system. A policy ministry reporting to politicians is unlikely to provide that comfort. Neither, for different reasons, is a research organisation with a particular mission and probably commercial incentives as well. Although the system organiser should certainly have close links to the research community and probably commission research that supports its evolution and improvement. So that's why I'm recommending that the government should revise the mandate of the Environmental Protection Authority to give it responsibility for the coordination, leadership and management of our environmental information system. As a Crown entity, the EPA, whose modus operandi is governed by statute with its own board, it's got the governance protections that are needed to make that work. A key responsibility for the EPA should be to improve the pipeline of information that flows through the new environmental information system. Identifying leverage points for technological innovation and fostering their adoption will be just as important as system oversight. New Zealand possesses the technical skills but lacks the coordination capacity and funding to implement technologies consistently and at the required scale. Now, one area in particular that we think requires a more deliberate and coordinated approach is the application of remote sensing. And I'm recommending that the government task a revised Environmental Protection Authority with identifying, sourcing and maintaining a set of critical remote sensing products for the benefit of all New Zealand. The goal should be to produce nationally consistent remote sensing information that is available to everyone. A fundamental shift rather than incrementalism is needed here. New Zealand's too small and its resources too slender to continue to have individual organisations and agencies negotiating separately for the same or very similar information. Finally, given the pace at which resource management reform is going, I'm making one recommendation specific to that reform. It is, I think, uncontroversial to say that the new resource management system needs to be grounded in high quality environmental information. However, the information base we currently possess simply doesn't meet that standard. The government is investing in some areas to improve the underlying data, but those data will take time to develop and disseminate. Meanwhile, regional spatial plans are required to be notified very rapidly, and there needs to be transparency about the information relied on during the development of those plans so that submitters can question its adequacy. Therefore, I'm recommending that the minister responsible for the planning bill, once enacted, should require councils to disclose the information that's been relied on in developing those proposed regional spatial plans and ensure that submissions on these plans can then comment on the adequacy of that information when they are notified. I think that would be a very useful discipline to hear from people affected by grand plans how much they really think the adequacy of the information base can support some of what's being proposed, and in that way point to the need for improvements. The current reforms of resource management, science, water services, local government, conservation and environmental reporting systems provide a once-in-a-generation opportunity to place information at the centre of environmental management. Seizing the opportunity to establish strong national leadership, common data standards and shared infrastructure will set these reforms up for success. Strong foundations will enable the widespread application of technological advances that can enable better monitoring, deeper environmental insights and more informed decision-making. That's why we are doing this, not because we have an obsession with either information or technology for its own sake. So that ends my presentation.